we're not talking about like some obscure small minority group. We're talking about almost 50% of the population.
Welcome to HFIG Talks, a podcast produced by the Human Factors Interest Group at the University of Toronto. HFIG is the student chapter of the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society at U of T and consists of students, faculty, and local professionals who are interested in the field of human factors.
Hi, my name is Chelsea, and I'm the president of HFIG.
My name is Dina, and I'm HFIG's treasurer. Chelsea and I are lucky to be among an amazing group of women who make up HFIG's executive team, so in this episode, we wanted to talk about women and human factors. Compared to other fields of engineering, human factors does generally have better representation of women, but we still have a long way to go until our work in this field is truly equitable, both in terms of the research that we're doing and the people who are doing it.
We interviewed Dr. Sarah Coppola, an assistant teaching professor at the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering at the University of Washington, and Dr. Cohen from Cedars-Sinai, who is the director of surgical safety and human factors research and a research scientist and assistant professor in the Department of Surgery. We talked to our guests about their experiences as women in human factors, how we could better promote women in the field, and how we could address some of the challenges to making our field more equitable and inclusive. So here's our conversation with Dr. Coppola and Dr. Cohen.
Hi, I'm Sarah Coppola. I am an assistant teaching professor at the University of Washington in Human-Centered Design and Engineering. So I originally studied mechanical engineering and user-centered design, and was very interested in how people used the things we were designing. I was a high school teacher for a year with AmeriCorps, and then I worked as an engineer at Hewlett-Packard for 2 years making printers. And the combination of things that happened, I realized I was more interested in the product failures that were related to a user than I was in the actual mechanical system failing. And I got hurt at work. So it was a combination of things with what was misdiagnosed as carpal tunnel syndrome. It was not carpal tunnel syndrome. I'll give away that story right away. And so in the midst of that, I was like thinking about doing graduate school in human factors. Started out in engineering education, actually. And my first year of grad school, by the end of the year, every single person in first year psychology statistics was wearing a wrist brace. So I started asking why. And the thing we all had in common is we were all small women, and all of the psych students had sat in the same room. They all had the same MacBook and at this fixed height desk that was just attached to the wall, and more or less the same chairs. And so I switched my research to physical ergonomics, trying to ask this question of why it is that women get hurt more by technology. Like, we clinically see this difference. We don't understand why. Although the answer, as like most things in human factors, right, we're quantifying the obvious, that it's that like the things don't fit you. They're not designed for you. And so from there, decided to stay in grad school, did a doctoral degree, and tried to really look at the exposure differential at like the actual human machine system level, biomechanics, for mostly input devices. Really looked at like hand input devices for computer technology.
It's so interesting hearing about Sarah's interests and backgrounds, because as a small female, I've certainly been impacted by a lot of these different things. I actually, unrelated to like a work injury, but I broke both of my wrists at the same time. And so learning how to navigate the world around me in 2 casts was incredibly difficult. And so this story resonates with me, especially given that my background isn't really in physical ergonomics. It's more so in cognitive ergonomics, but we'll get into that a little bit more. But Sarah, I'm just so impressed by what you do, and your story is really interesting. So I'm excited to learn more. But again, for everybody, my name is Tara Cohen, and I'm the director of surgical safety and human factors research at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, which is in Los Angeles. I actually grew up in Seattle, so I'm jealous that you're at the University of Washington, and always am excited to hear from people who are there. I'm also a research scientist and assistant professor in the Department of Surgery at Cedars, and my research really spans across a few areas that aim to identify opportunities to improve safety, efficiency, and well-being for those individuals in healthcare. So For the past few years, I've been primarily focusing on studying workflow disruptions or deviations from the natural progression of tasks in various surgical procedures. And my pathway to human factors was a little interesting. I was first introduced to the field by my friend and first flight instructor. So I got my pilot's license when I was 19, and my flight instructor at the time was, telling me about her interests in aviation and kind of trying to improve safety and efficiency in the field. And she had ended up working at the Federal Aviation Administration, and I was working on my pilot's license during college. So I was studying psychology and kind of saying, I love aviation, but I love psychology, and I'd love to figure out how to marry the two. And she said, there's this field called human factors, and I think you might be really interested in it. So why don't you come do an internship at the FAA and see if this is something you're interested in? So I did that, and I finished my internship, and I was like, okay, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to do human factors in aviation. That's my entire life. So I applied to Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University thinking natural fit. And the guy I wanted to work with after I got accepted said, aviation's great. I still do a lot of work in aviation, but I'm transitioning into just focusing on healthcare. So if you want to work with me, you're going to start doing some healthcare work. And I was like, okay, I don't know any differently. So I kind of jumped into the healthcare arena with no information, but totally fell in love because healthcare can really benefit like a lot of different industries and fields from the application of human factors, and have been doing work in the healthcare arena ever since.
Yeah, I forgot to say I did my postdoc in healthcare, looking at anesthesia safety.
Anesthesia safety?
Mm-hmm. In the operating room.
Okay, very cool. Anesthesiologists are so interesting.
Such a fascinating user group. Yeah. Absurd amount of working memory.
I can't even imagine.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah, so our next question after that was whether you could talk about your experiences as a woman in the field of human factors.
I can go. So for me, I don't think the field of human factors is inherently different than research in academia in general when it comes to being a female in the field, at least from my personal experience. Over the course of my graduate career, most of the people I directly collaborated with were male. I completed my graduate studies at a male-dominated university. I think female students make up less than 25% of the student population at Embry-Riddle in particular. And while our program had probably the highest ratio of female professors and students compared to the other departments on campus, we kind of considered ourselves female island and male world. I was working with a lot of male advisors and male colleagues. My dissertation committee consisted of 4 males and 1 female. And while my experience was quite positive, I still had to learn how to navigate in a very male-dominated environment. And it wasn't a bad thing, but it's kind of, trying to, you look around and everyone around you looks a certain way and, has a way of expressing themselves or responding to emails or engaging in conversations that's just different than what you're used to. And so I think it was learning how to navigate that was a little bit challenging, but I was really, really lucky that I have had female role models in male dominated industries, which kind of gave me, I don't want to say a leg up, but insight into that world and how to behave and how to operate. Like I said, my first flight instructor who introduced me to the FAA was female. And she was able to hold her own very well at a very male-dominated institution. And my mentor, I did an internship at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, and my mentor there was Susan Hallbeck, who's the past president of HFES. And she was just such a phenomenal mentor and never made me question if women should or shouldn't be in leadership roles. And so I think I was very lucky that I had female role models to kind of blaze the trail ahead and give me a model for which to aspire to. And I'd say that things got a little tougher as I started my career in healthcare. Surgery, like aviation, is also highly male dominated. And it's a field full of some of the hardest working most intelligent people that I've ever met, but it can be really difficult to assert yourself and demonstrate your competence and capabilities among surgeons in particular. I'm sure Sarah can attest to feeling the same way around anesthesiologists. But, you know, again, I was really lucky that my boss, who's the chair of surgery and really well respected, and as a surgeon, encouraged and often demanded my involvement, which really helped to, I think, give me the courage to step in and demonstrate that I was competent and had the skill set to accomplish what I needed to accomplish. So, you know, I think it doesn't mean that I didn't have challenges. I certainly did, but I definitely leaned on the people that I had as role models. So for me, my experience has been positive, but it's also been learning how to navigate these environments as well.
Yeah, I also had very few women across my education. Though my graduate school programs were both almost entirely women students, all of the faculty were men. And at Harvard, my department was started by the first female professor ever at Harvard, and still they had just tenured their first ever woman professor in 100 years of that department. So it was like 60 professors, and 3 women were tenure track, 1 was tenured. The rest were almost entirely white men, actually. And so it was just a very weird dynamic, but you see that in English departments and psychology departments too, where all of the students are women, all of the professors are men, right? So there's still this power issue going on. And because I did my doctoral work in women's occupational health, I can talk a lot about that, why that happens. But for me, it struck me one point that when I was going to write my acknowledgement section in my dissertation, I was not going to name a single woman, despite writing a dissertation on women. And so recruited some undergrad engineering majors to work on my projects, and made sure I was the TA for the 1 woman professor in my department, so that I would have that. But I really didn't have female mentors at all. And until my postdoc, one of my PIs in my postdoc was a woman. And then now I'm on a faculty that is 60% women, and it is absolutely bizarre to be in that situation. It's very strange to me. So yeah, we have enough that we can start talking about these things and advocating for issues like family leave, things that disproportionately affect women.
Yeah, I can relate to the fact, being in a female majority undergrad degree. I did my undergrad in cognitive neuroscience in the psychology department. So almost all of the students in my classes were female. I think all of my psychology professors were men. And my master supervisor was a man, but Dina and I are both lucky enough that we have a really great supervisor, really great female mentor. But that being said, I would say it's not the norm, probably, for most grad students even.
Yeah, I think my experience was a little bit different. I mean, my undergraduate degree was in electrical and computer engineering, so it was mostly male dominated in terms of the students and the faculty. But then I worked for a while in the technology sector. So I was a software developer. So that was also mostly a male dominated field. I did have some coworkers and supervisors who were female, but it was mostly men. And then really when I did go into human factors, or when I did discover human factors, that was the one time, or that was when I started being involved in a field that was actually more balanced, basically. And I did have a wonderful master's advisor, and I'm currently working with a wonderful PhD advisor, both of whom are women. So, and I think our lab is mostly female dominated. We do have some male colleagues, but most of the students and postdocs in our lab are women. So I feel like we're both very lucky.
I think it's also interesting that my perception, and maybe it's because our lab is a little bit more maybe like gender balanced than other labs are. But my perception is kind of like human factors is a little bit more balanced in that way, but maybe it's just like in comparison to all of these other fields. Yes, it is more balanced, but it isn't balanced. If that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, you have to look at who's in power, like who are senior and who's in power, right?
Yeah.
With all of these things. And so I think we are almost gender balanced, but that doesn't mean like the people who have the power are equal. And then I also look at it. So I'm on the HFIS diversity committee and the women's committee and the disability, like these are, like, this is what I do. I study and I teach, right? Is that it's white women who have made it, right? And so we're like, it's not all women who have been able to achieve those, the few positions of power that are held by women are often, there's all these other aspects of identity that are intersecting there.
Absolutely. Yeah. I guess kind of building on that, what are some of the things that you think could be done to promote women in human factors or in research in general? Or are there any things that have been done that you thought were particularly effective?
So one thing that keeps coming up is research participants should be as close to parity as possible unless there's a real reason not to, right? So if you're studying testicular cancer, I understand that you didn't recruit a whole bunch of people who were assigned female at birth. But every time I'm asked to review a paper on upper extremity ergonomics or biomechanics, and you've only recruited 12 men between the ages of 18 and 23, right? We have to stop. Those should be getting benched, rejected. There's no excuse at all to not recruit some form of, I realize that it is hard to get a diverse population and we have small n in biomechanics, but we're not talking about like some obscure small minority group. We're talking about almost 50% of the population, right? And so and I mean like 49.9% of the population, right? So it's like, we're not like, and I was chasing a reference from Journal of Biomechanics that showed, it was actually a conference, that like 80% of participants of studies that have been published are men, right? The authors are all men, right? Like, so we have this like massive gender bias. And then clinically we see all these injuries. I'm talking about physical injuries, not even like, and then the psychosocial stuff is really important too. So that's one thing, is like, we need to reject this as bad science. Like, I shouldn't have to explain to you that women are people too at this point in time. And then like thinking about the context. So Karen Messing talks about this a lot. She said she wasn't, you are Canadian, and I'm going to mess up the name of the school, but somewhere in Montreal. And this idea that women have multiple roles and they're always intersecting. And so thinking about how, right, the multiple roles that like society puts on women, how that affects their career. And so like when human factors and ergonomics is over Halloween, right, that probably disproportionately affects mothers, and it affects fathers too, and non-binary parents, right? But like the cultural, social cost of parenting is often on women, and we look differently at women who miss a holiday than we do at men who miss a holiday, right? And so those sorts of things. Is there access to a place to breastfeed? If you bring your child with you, can you bring your child with you? Like, will you be, what is the environment like for those sorts of things? So like the more like thinking about these conflicting roles, thinking about like elder care, right, is also often done by women. And so like right now is like seeing the drastic differences in who's publishing in the last year, right? There's a massive gender difference. There's also been a massive gender difference in who's dropping out of the labor market, right? And so how like understanding that complexity of factors, I think, is really important.
That was so well said. And your point about research and publishing made me think of, did you guys hear of the med bikini thing that happened? So for Chelsea and Dina, and Sarah, feel free to jump in because you may remember it better than I do, but it was in the summer of 2020, an article came out looking at professionalism of physicians based on their social media pictures. And essentially, the criteria for what was or was not professional was different for women versus men. So if a woman was in a picture in a bathing suit, she lost a point of being professional. So she lost a professionalism point. And basically, that same criteria wasn't withheld for men. And the article came out and it was written by all men, basically deeming that the females were more unprofessional than the males. And this was there is a huge gender gap in the entire paper. And I believe the authors even, they came out and apologized and then requested to retract their study. But it's a really interesting example of inequality and where we've gone wrong in research, not considering your entire population. So yeah, Sarah's nodding her head. I think you heard about this, right?
It was peer reviewed, right?
Yeah.
So, right? Like reviewers said, sure, this is fair. And an editor said, sure, let's publish this.
That's
when
the
you
thing.
said article, I thought you meant news article because it sounded
like a legitimate journal article.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, I forget which journal it was, but like the Journal of American Medical Association recently published something saying like, no doctor is racist, therefore structural racism doesn't exist, right? So our medical journals are not quite caught up with the reality of, people's lives in 2021.
That also kind of highlights clearly whoever they have doing those reviews I would assume is predominantly male and probably predominantly white if those sorts of things are getting through peer review kind of like no problem.
Right. And it speaks to another point that Sarah made. And I think, when we talk about that there should be equality in, who you're recruiting, at least, at the bare minimum with gender for certain studies. And I think you mentioned, Sarah, sometimes it's difficult to recruit, but then there should be mechanisms in place by which organizations recognize that it is difficult, and there should be funding to help recruit. There should be resources available to help do this. You should learn in graduate school, okay, where do I go? How do I recruit people? What is ethically appropriate? And not to say that those things don't exist, but I think more emphasis needs to be played on inclusivity and diversity. And, I think a couple other things that can be done involve getting leadership support. So having leaders who are male or female supporting their junior female colleagues or other colleagues, so mentoring them towards leadership and giving them credit when credit is due in front of other colleagues, I think can really help to build up women, especially. And then I think there's a general lack of how to achieve these things as a female or, a student of otherness in academia. I know, in my graduate program, we had great courses and we had a student chapter of HFIS, but no one sat down and taught me, how do I negotiate? How do I negotiate pay raises? How do I negotiate more responsibility? How do I negotiate for resources? What positions do I apply for? I think there's a relatively well-known study, and I wish I had looked it up, but men will apply more for positions that they meet less qualifications for than women. We're more likely to look at something and say, I don't think I'm going to meet all the qualifications, I'm not going to apply, where typically men will just apply for those things. And so we need to be mentored, and it doesn't only need to be women. All students need to be mentored on this, but what positions do I apply for? What does leadership look like, and what skills are required for leadership? How can I start honing in on those skills now? and educating early. And I think, this can be done in courses, it can be done through society chapters, it can be done through webinars. Cedars was really great. They started this women's leadership program where you apply and you get in, and then you're mentored by leaders at the institution, but they also bring in additional leaders. And I think we talk about things like, how do you deal with an ethical issue? How do you manage talking to a reporter when they want to publish your research study to a news outlet? And so all of these are really important skill sets that I think we need to be educating people on really, really early, and supporting people. And I think that's tough, but there's the research side of things that needs some work, but I think we also need to be educating the people who are going to be becoming the next set of leaders on how to actually get there.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think some of these things that we do learn just from experience or observation, just like by observing our mentors, but I do think that there is a need for like a more formalized mechanism of like introducing that education early on to graduate students, especially, women and other minority graduate students, right? So definitely needed and definitely lacking in a lot of institutions. Maybe now I'm starting to hear more about people who are advocating for this, but I feel like it's still very early and not as much as we actually need. Yeah.
And I think another thing is like educating everyone on these biases, because I watched the documentary, I think it's called Picture a Scientist, but it's on women in STEM. And one of the statistics that they provided was, or one of the studies that they talked about was where they gave 2 resumes for, I think it was a lab manager position. The resumes were exactly the same. One of them was named Jennifer and one of them was named John. Maybe the names are wrong, but basically one was a man, one was a woman. And the men were consistently rated as like more capable, more likely to get the job, when everything else was exactly the same. And I think if people don't know necessarily that they might be perceiving someone in a different way because of their gender. So like just letting people know that this is a thing that happens, it's just kind of an inherent bias that we have because of the way that society has been as we've kind of grown up, so that they can become aware of those things and try and account for that in some way.
Yeah, so even with that story about the professionalism thing, so that is also a bias that people in society have. Like, what does it mean to be professional? And then the criteria vary a lot for women and for different races. So that itself, like, is by itself is a bias that people have, and then that gets sort of included or built into that research, even though you would think that, some people can evaluate professionalism in an objective way, but it doesn't seem that they can. I think you did talk a bit about gender issues in your own field of study, or academia in general, but maybe you can give some examples on how you can eliminate or mitigate some of these gender biases that exist in your research, and also possibly how they could interact with other identities, and how we can possibly make our research more equitable for different groups.
So yeah, I think I did want to touch on, another gender issue, which I think Sarah also talked about this, but the idea that there's very few women in leadership positions in academic medical centers or in academic positions at all. But, what's interesting is I think movement is happening and shifting, but we're not there yet. So for example, in my field, in surgery, despite more women entering into medical school and residency, in fact, it's almost equitable or equivalent now. It's about 50% of first-year medical students are women. And women have comprised 40% of general surgery residency programs, which is, great to see. But I think a 2020 journal article found that 28 of 354 academic surgical departments chair positions were held by women. So that's just under 8%. So you can see that, early, we're starting to become a little bit more equal, in terms of gender differences. We're seeing more women enter into medical school, more women enter into residencies, but getting to those leadership positions is really, really tough. So I just kind of wanted to put some numbers behind that. When I think of how we can use our human factors knowledge and skills to address these issues, I go back to the idea that when we think about research, we think about things critically. We're constantly testing, we're retesting, and we're reevaluating our environments. We're adapting to the ever-changing nature of whatever environment that we're studying. And I think we have to think about our society as this ever-changing, adapting environment. And ultimately, human factors involve studying how humans interact with complex systems. And complex systems involve different types of humans that have different sexes, races, genders, ages, cultures, you name it. And all of those interactions are going to result in different processes and different outcomes. And so if we're not trying to understand all of those different interactions, I don't think we're really doing due diligence. And it's tough. It's really tough. You're not going to be able to recruit 100 participants of every single group for a particular study, and that may not be necessary. But when we're asking questions involving human performance, in surgery, for example, we need to be considering all of the potential users and how their different backgrounds or cultures may interact. And I think, human factors professionals are uniquely qualified because we should be thinking about all of these things all of the time. Are we? Not always. I think, sometimes our motivations are stifled by funding, are stifled by pressure to publish, get those grants. And that's why I keep going back to this idea that it needs to be top down. We need to be, finding ways to promote this type of work and say that this is the way it needs to go. As Sarah alluded to, we can't be just accepting papers that aren't making a rigorous effort to be more inclusive and to demonstrate differences or findings as they relate to sex or gender differences, for example. So, I think it's really honing in on what we study as a group and kind of going back to the basics and understanding that we're studying systems and there's all these different types of humans in these systems. But yeah.
If that study looked at orthopedic surgery or just general surgery?
The one about the chairs.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was academic surgical department chairs. So probably everybody.
Because a lot of the orthopedic tools are not usable for the average woman. They're
absolutely
like the bones weigh 50 pounds and they're big. And so I had a colleague who did that for her graduate work. Right. And there's no market incentive to change that, but it's one of the biggest barriers to women in orthopedic surgery beyond the cultural. We always blame culture, but there's just a total mismatch between the tool and the surgeon, and also would exclude smaller men, especially Asian men, who are on average about the same size as the average European woman, right? It's not just, So I think it's really important to think about those intersections of identity. And as Tara was talking about, we're in a society, we have to think about how society functions and change it. And it is I feel like because I was mentored only by men, I was very much socialized into operating and surviving in a way that is socialized very male, at least in the US context, very male. And I found myself mentoring younger women to act like that. And then I realized I'm asking them to change all of who they are to exist in this toxic environment. Instead, I should be changing this environment. And so, right, what are those intangible kind of cultural pieces that are so unwelcoming to women or people of color, or, you know, like all of the various diversity. So I do a lot of disability work, right? And so like some of it's really obvious. Like if there's a step up to get in the building, no one who uses a wheelchair can come in your building. And that is most of Harvard, right? Is a step up, is completely inaccessible. And Tufts, actually both schools are completely inaccessible. And right. And so like, but that's an obvious thing. Like how do you think about like neurodiversity or mental health conditions and how that interacts with the environment? And then things like race, right? So Title IX in the US protects women from gender harassment or sex or gender-based harassment. But what happens when it's racial harassment and you're the same sex or the same gender, right? There's no mechanism for protection there. And so starting to think about like, you know, like these intersections, and I'm as a white woman, like how am I propagating these problematic systems and structures of whiteness as I'm still like fighting the patriarchy and trying to like break through the glass ceiling, right? And like protect now that I'm in a professor role, but I have no power because I'm junior, like, right? I'm trying to protect my students from the patriarchy while also, you know, and it just like feels like we're lost in this system, and that I'm mostly just frustrated all of the time because I feel like I should have power and I have none. And I feel like I should fix things and I can't. And that might just be being a millennial and being like caught between the, you know, the boomers and the Gen Zs the Gen Zs are going to burn it down. And so there's a great Canadian study that looked like a massive population and found one of the best predictors of neck and shoulder pain, like what we would think would be like ergonomic pain, was sexual harassment in the workplace, right? So these experiences of harassment, right, we know affect your physical pain, because as you're being sexually harassed, you do this, and then you're like typing, and right. But we also know a whole bunch about how like racial harassment affects the physical body, right? Like it affects, like it changes your DNA, right, over time. And so you can chase it generationally, but also like birth outcomes. And right, we see this massive disparity in birth outcomes in the US, racial disparity in birth outcomes, right? It's like experiences of racism over time cause all of these downstream health effects. And so it's not just like, we're like, oh, it's unfair, like we should have diverse professors or we should have diverse CEOs. It's like, no, we're actually like harming people, like people's physical health and mental health. But like we have like proof that it's physical as well.
Yeah, it's interesting to also think about that physical ergonomics side of things. So, I mean, you mentioned sexual harassment in the workplace, but also I do think that society and like men in general do have this sort of sense of entitlement over women's bodies where they feel like they can like violate your physical or personal space in a way. So that could also be, you know, correlated with how women try to like
make themselves
away. Yeah. So
there's also a lot of added stress that comes from all of the other stuff that we have to kind of monitor in this sort of like professionalism realm. Like when I'm writing an email, I check the email several times. Did I use too many exclamation marks?
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Or do I sound
too much?
Yeah. Like, do I sound friendly enough when I'm asking for something, or do I sound demanding? And I feel like that all that extra like stress that comes along with thinking about these things that men probably don't think about also adds to maybe the
physical strain, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean, I have heard the term minority stress, but I don't know if it's applicable. Like I haven't read a lot of the research on it, but yeah, if you're a woman of color, I feel like it's also, you know, even
compounded.
Amplified. Yeah, compounded. Yeah.
I feel like I'm the killjoy always. Like people come to me with these things, and they're like, want to look at my cool technology, and it's like, if it's VR, I'm like, most women can't use VR headsets, right? Get vertigo. They're not, right? Exoskeletons. I can't tell you how many times people have wanted to show me an exoskeleton, and I've looked at it and go, it won't fit me. Like, yeah, we shrunk, like we have like a 5'4" version. I'm like, it's not going to fit me. And then they force me to put it on. And of course, it doesn't fit my shoulders. and it doesn't fit my chest. And I was like, were you aware that like a large percentage of the population has breasts, right? And I showed them my
factored in.
right? I buy a women's backpack, right? Like the straps are very different, like they hurt, right? Like, and so things like that. And exoskeletons in the work are meant to like help smaller people who are at risk of injury not get injured, but then they design them for, like it, it's so backward. So what I've decided to do is to teach primarily undergrads and to get them thinking about these things before they go into the workplace, because someday they're going to be in a boardroom and it's unrealistic that they're going to have representation in that room, right? They're not going to have one. They're not going to like, there's just, you have 100 people, you're still not going to have one of each. And so I want my student to raise the flag that goes like, ooh, that could be harmful to this group of people, right? Like, ooh, that looks like a blackface filter. Maybe we shouldn't do that, So if we teach them young, maybe.
I love that. That's so important. And I think it's lacking so much right now. And I'm so glad that you're doing that, Sarah, because you make such an important point, right? Because it's the people who, end up getting to the stage where they develop these technologies that are supposed to be helpful. They're intended to be useful, but they don't have, like you said, whether it's representation or not, or at least somebody who's going to say, hold up, I don't know if this is going to work for that group. It reminded me when you talked about the idea that people don't even consider that women have breasts. We're doing this study now that what does a mannequin look like if you're going to practice CPR? Have any of you guys seen mannequins with breasts?
Nope.
And if you're going to defibrillate them, you have to put on pads, and pads go underneath the breast. And if you don't practice doing that, how are you going to be prepared to do it? And it's like, we have had technologies out there that are supposed to be helpful, and we've trained how many doctors or how many healthcare professionals on how to perform CPR or defibrillation using what looks like a 19-year-old boy. Like, does that represent our population at all? Any of our population? No, especially not in the United States. So, I think, and educating, if one person who had been on the committee in the boardroom when they presented, hey, this is our mannequin to represent every person in America, was like, oh, I don't think that represents even 80% of America, maybe things would have been different. And so I think Sarah brings up such an important point, that it's education early, but I think we need the resources and support, or from an organization standpoint or from a societal standpoint, to make sure that those things happens. I think your course, Sarah, needs to be at every institution in the United States. Like this, it shouldn't just be unique to your program.
Should push this book because it was written by 3 people from HFES.
Absolutely.
Advancing Diversity, Inclusion, and Social Justice Through Human Systems Engineering, edited by Rod Roscoe, Aaron Chu, and Abigail Holdridge.
Awesome.
Tara, do you know what your family leave policies are? Like,
I don't know off the top of my head. I want to say they're pretty good compared to other industries.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Some residency programs won't let you have time to to pump. And so, and you think about it, like, yeah, that would be rough if you're doing like an 8-hour surgery. I don't know how you navigate that, but the typical resident could probably fit it into their day with accommodations.
I think that's one of those things that ends up affecting why we don't have as many people in leadership positions, because you have people who are interested and, it's like maybe gender equal there, and people who get into residency, sure. But then they don't have, like, there are these restrictions, or they don't have the ability to kind of do the things they need to do and continue to advance their career.
Yeah. The other thing that always struck me in academic medicine was footwear. Right? It's like, for some reason, a lot of the women clinicians wear heels when they're not in the OR. And so they can't walk as fast as their male colleagues. Despite
that's
they're
really
also
interesting.
shorter. And I always like, I don't get it. you don't like, you're in a job where you don't have to do this. You could wear Crocs, like no, right?
Right.
And it was, yeah. And like, you can't keep up. I had a female boss at HP who told me this. She was like, never wear heels because you can't keep up with them. And it just it propagates the problem. And she's like, and your feet hurt. Like, why would you do that?
Yeah.
But it's also a part of professionalism though. Like a lot of people think, oh, you have to wear heels as a woman to look professional. But yeah.
And you risk falling. Can't
Twisting
walk
your ankle.
Sore heels. Yeah.
That's a really interesting point. I'd be curious. I wonder if there's been studies.
Yeah, I want to like specifically do it in academic medicine because I don't get it. Like,
yeah, and that's such a good point because they, in surgery, they're not wearing heels, obviously. People are wearing Crocs, sneakers. A lot of male surgeons wear cowboy boots, which I always find fascinating to me. I've seen that a handful of times. And
never would have thought.
But not in clinic. When they're in clinic, it's very different. It's and I think that's something too about the professionalism thing, especially in healthcare when you're patient facing, it's very difficult to, I think, be your most comfortable self, where especially when the organization places demands on what you should wear and how you should act and how your hair should be and how long your skirt needs to be and things like that. It almost puts you into, okay, here's another set of rules and things I have to think about when I'm getting ready every day, which is just like this mental process you're going through before you even start your day, right? You're like, wait, is this appropriate? Is my nail polish too pink or whatever? I don't know. I haven't seen specific rules about that, but I think this professionalism thing, as you guys alluded to with the email too, is just, we're constantly thinking like, am I professional enough? Am I going to be perceived as professional and responsible and competent? And that's just a lot to deal with.
Yeah. And post-pandemic, a lot of us don't want to go back to that. Right.
Mm-mm.
Yeah. Like I'm not looking forward to wondering if I should be wearing makeup or straightening my hair. My politics in 2020 were let women be ugly. And I think they will probably be my 2021 politics as well. Just let women be ugly.
Yeah. But the thing that's frustrating is it's not ugly, right? It's like, let us be ourselves. And society says that we need makeup and to straighten our hair and to wear a nice blouse and a bra to be pretty and professional, right? Right? Like, it's like the thing with the email. I found myself coaching one of my research assistants. I was like, let me read your email before you send it. And I was like, okay, don't say sorry. Like, let's take this out, get rid of the exclamation point. Don't explain what you're doing. Just say you're doing it.
Like, yeah, like that.
Get rid of no worries. Like, just, and I was, talking to a friend and colleague about this. And she was like, but it shouldn't matter how we express ourselves. We're changing how we're expressing ourselves to be perceived on an even playing field. But I shouldn't be perceived any less than because I say, hey, exclamation point, how's your day going? Like it's this battle that we're constantly like, okay, how much of myself do I be? How much do I take out? How do I be perceived as professional all the time? And it's exhausting.
This was such an interesting and insightful discussion. Thank you to Dr. Cohen and Dr. Coppola for taking the time to talk to us. We've certainly learned a lot, and we think it's important to continue these conversations so that we can see real and meaningful change. And to our listeners, we hope you enjoyed our podcast and stay tuned for another episode of HFIG Talks.